Go ahead and call the work session to order this morning. And I think you have something to say, do you not?
I do. Good morning, Lisa Barrett with Building and Development Services. I would just like to introduce Pat Tyeski with SNME Consultants from Orlando, and I think most of you are familiar with Pat and her work that we've been working with her closely with our past code and comprehensive plan amendments. And this work session today is just to go over, again, as a refresher, some of the amendments that we are working on currently with both the comprehensive plan and the land development code. The last work session that we had with the Planning Commission and the board was back in August of 2017. And now that we are coming closer with some of the amendments, we were bringing the comprehensive plan amendments to the Planning Commission in May. We just wanted to have a refresher with the Planning Commission, and this is also televised, so hopefully the public and the Board of County Commissioners will be listening to the work session. And with that, I'll bring Pat up so we can get started.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. I have a PowerPoint that we're going to go through. And I'm going to go back to the beginning, give you a little bit of the background of what we have been doing, how we got here. So the agenda, next slide. So first we're going to talk about that background and the scope, what we're really supposed to be doing. Going to talk a little bit about development review, how it works today. And then we're going to get into the issues that we're addressing with this project, which include the special approval, plan development, clustering, the relationship between future land use and zoning, and mixed use in general. And then we're going to talk about the schedule, and then we can get into discussion. So in terms of the background, sometimes people think that we have been doing this for a long time, but next slide, please. It has been divided into phases, and every phase that we had taken, we have finished it. So like when we started this project or this work on the LDC, we started with a code reorganization. So in 2015, the county adopted a reorganized land development code. At that time, the direction was just to reorganize it and clarify things without changing regulations. So that's why we knew there were some issues, but we could not really go into changing regulations. So that was the only purpose of that exercise, just to reorganize it. Then we came back and we started taking the fixing of the code in stages. So the main priority at the time was the urban core of the county. Development was just not happening there. We were trying to figure out why, and realized that we were applying the same suburban regulations all over the county. So we undertook this project, we called it the urban corridors, and ended up making changes to the land development code and the comprehensive plan to make sure that redevelopment would be enticed and would be easier to do in the urban core. Once that was done, then we said, okay, what else do we have going on that we really need to fix? So we determined a bunch of different topics. So one had to do with the special approval process. Staff has struggled with that process, and the development community has struggled with that process, and even the public have struggled with that process because it is complicated, and some portions of it are in the comp plan, some portions are in the land development code. So we just wanted to look at it and figure out how we could fix it. Then plan development. We realized that plan development was a big deal in the county, and we wanted to see how it was working and if we needed to make some improvements. Then there were other little issues like access, regulations to subdivisions, consistency between the plan and the land development code, and the commercial locational criteria, and even signs. Now, signs we decided to do as a separate exercise, and we're working with staff on that, but all the other items I'm going to mention today. So in terms of development review, to make it just very simplistic. So next slide, please. When you think about how development review process works, you start with your future land use map. So whoever has a piece of property, they have to look at what is my future land use category. If that one is correct, then you go to your zoning map. And then you look at your zoning, and depending on what zoning district you have, then you look at a list of uses in your land development code, and it says that your use is either permitted or it requires special permit. But in addition to that, and we go to the next slide, sometimes in the comprehensive plan and sometimes in the land development code, it would say, well, your activity also requires special approval. So that's like on top of whatever your table of uses would say. And then next slide. And other times, even before you get to your zoning, the comp plan may send you through the plan development process. So, these two triggers make things a little bit more complicated than they should be in some cases. So we took a look at those two. Now, just so that you have an understanding on what the differences are between those processes, when you have a permitted use, it means that it's deemed to be compatible. It can go through administrative review, and they can approve your use. Now, if it says that you have a special permit use, that means that the use is generally compatible, but it still has to be reviewed by a hearing officer to make sure you're not going to have any impacts on the surrounding uses or on public facilities and services, and that it still meets the general requirements of the comp plan and the LDC. Now, for special approval, it's very similar to the special permit review because you're supposed to be looking for potential impacts on surrounding uses, public facilities and services, but then it adds a third one, which is the natural environment. So it was interesting to us that the special permit would not look at the environment because it assumes that they meet code, but the special approval would. So that was one thing that we had to keep in mind. Now, a lot of people talk about, what is the special permit criteria? When we are reviewing a use for special permit approval, what are we looking at? That is specified in the code, and it's section 316.6. Basically, you have to look at it to make sure that it is consistent with the plan and the LDC. You have to look at the impact on public health, safety, and welfare. You have to look at the impact on surrounding properties, impact on public streets, compatibility with surrounding uses and the character of the area. You have to look at the impact on archaeological, historical, and cultural resources. And here's something that we're trying to add there as part of these amendments. We also want them to look at natural resources. And then the last one is the use of screening and buffers needed to improve compatibility and harmony. So whenever you look at any special permit requirement in the county, you have to look at all those criteria. So it is pretty similar to the special approval. Now, plan development is a completely different animal by itself because when you look at a plan development, it's either because you have a specialized purpose, it's not something typical. You require some flexibility of regulations. There may be some stipulations that need to be made before you approve it, and it typically relates to a specific site design. So that's, what typically plan development is. Now, in addition to that, whether it's permitted or special permit or plan development.
Pat, before you move on, a couple questions.
Sure.
The hearing officer, the special permit, is that a public process?
I'll let staff explain how it works, but because there have been questions about how many hearing officers we have and how it's done. So maybe Lisa, want to.
Yeah. Am I on now?
I don't know.
Is it? Hello? Hello?
I think so.
Hello. Yes, a hearing officer is a special permit application goes to the hearing officer, and it's an advertised public hearing.
Okay. Is there public comment?
Yes.
Okay. Special approval, it says various. What does that mean?
And I'll explain that in a.
And then the plan development, that'll be binding, the PD. You said it's tied to a specific.
And we'll go through that in a little bit too.
Okay.
I have specific slides for those too.
Thank you.
So in addition to being a special permit that goes to a hearing officer or a plan development, there are other types of application that would dictate whether you go to the Planning Commission, to the DRC, to the hearing officer, or to the board. And those are spelled out in Chapter 3 also. So if you're doing a subdivision, you have to go through the platting process. So that implies you have to go through a certain process. If you require zoning map amendments or land use amendments, that would take you through a process. Sometimes you have like duplication of reviews. So that was something that we needed to consider. So in the next slide, so now we're going to talk about special approval, and I'm going to get into more detail as to what that means and when it is required. So the comprehensive plan was the document that established that special approval. And basically the purpose of it is to determine the potential impact on natural resources, adjacent land uses, and public facilities. Now, when special approval was created, that was back in '89 when the comprehensive plan was rewritten, the idea was that they were adding certain policies to the comprehensive plan, but they knew that we didn't have specific regulations at the time to make sure that those policies would be implemented the right way. So they said we need to protect the properties in the coastal area. So they wanted to make sure that the board at the time was going to look at anything that happened in the coastal area to make sure that there were not going to be impacts. And there were other things like, if you're going to do mixed use, you need to go through this special approval. It was like, because we didn't know what mixed use was at the time. We were not doing mixed use, so we wanted to make sure that somebody was looking at that. Over the years, the Land Development Code has been amended and new regulations have been drafted. And we have learned that some of those concerns that they had back in '89 have already been addressed by new regulations. So that was something that we needed to look into. Have the regulations that have been adopted, are they addressing those concerns? So we can go to the next slide. So when the special approval was created back then in '89, there was a huge list of items that would send you through special approval. And this is a table that was inserted into Chapter 3 of the Land Development Code, and of course it's not intended to be read, it's just to show you the amount of information that there is in that table. And that list is not all-inclusive. There are other activities that we found sprinkled throughout the plan and the LDC that would still send you through that special approval. So we took one by one all these items and did an analysis. Why is the special approval needed? Do we have the regulations in place? Are they working? Should some other type of development review be adopted instead, or maybe it could be administrative? So we'll go to the next, okay, this slide. So to classify those 50-plus activities, we realized that there were some similarities. So like the first one, for example, the plan stated that certain uses, and it was random uses, or a mix of uses within certain land use categories would have to get special approval. Examples of that would be if you had rural recreation projects within the ag district, you would have to get special approval. Or if you had marina type uses or RV parks, they would have to go through this special approval process. Then it said, for example, if you have a residential 6 land use category, which the 6 kind of indicates that that would be your maximum density. But there is a policy that says, but if your density exceeds 4.5, then you need to go through special approval. And every land use category has something like that. So it was kind of strange for us that you do have this future land use category that allows up to 6, but the top portion of that density still requires some special approval. There was another one related to the commercial locational criteria, and I'll talk about that one later. But if you are taking advantage of the commercial locational criteria, there are certain density or intensity ranges that would send you through special approval. There is one future land use category that is called industrial urban, and it says that if you're going to expand it, you need to get special approval. Anytime you expand any land use category, it has to come through the board anyway. So that was kind of strange that you would require 2 different types of review. You have some land use categories, mixed use, attraction, and mixed use community that they all require projects to get special approval. Even detailed provisions like expanding an existing industrial use, that would send you through special approval. Projects within the watershed, coastal high hazard, airport impact, coastal evacuation area, and the FIG overlay districts, special approval. If you're adjacent to a perennial lake or stream, same thing. If you're doing affordable housing at higher densities, taking advantage of a bonus system, special approval. If you're in the sewer service area and you cannot connect to the central system, same thing. If you were going to do clustering, same thing. Relocating a utilities corridor, special approval. If you're within the 25-year floodplain, same thing. Even if you're just using mitigation techniques, extra buffering or something like that, same thing. So we realized that a lot of those activities already had other ways of getting to them, like plan development or regulations. So we did this analysis for each one of them. Next slide. So the bottom line when we went through the special approval was, number one, out of the 50-plus activities, we found that a lot of them already had regulations in place that were detailed. If you're going to be located next to a perennial like or stream, there is a required setback, and you cannot impact certain wetlands, and certain provisions that were already in place to take care of that. In some cases, instead of saying you require special approval, we were saying you can either go through administrative permit, which is administrative approval, which means you just meet code. Staff is not going to waive anything that the code says. Or if it is a particular use that needs some public input, then we would send them through special permit instead. And then in several cases, we figured out that it will still need to go to the board. And those cases typically would say something like, you cannot waive those buffer requirements unless there is an overriding public interest or public benefit. In those cases, we figured out, okay, that requires waiving a requirement. That still needs to go to the board. Staff is not going to be waiving anything that the code says or the comp plan says. So we are still preserving that type of review. We're just not calling it special approval. And there was something about the question that you asked about special approval that I was going to mention too. The designate. So originally it was thought that any special approval would go to the board, but the Land Development Code says, for example, that if you're going to take a project through different types of review, that special approval can be handled at the first type of review. So if there is a project that has to go through a preliminary plan and then something else and something else, whoever reviews that preliminary plan would at that time review it for special approval. So it's not just the board approving special approvals.
Okay, and you had mentioned a couple times you used the word waiving certain requirements, but you haven't mentioned a waiver. Is there a formal waiver process other than a board action?
Okay, there are two ways of looking at that. So whenever staff approves something, so somebody submits an application, they go through the comprehensive plan and the land development code, and they review everything, and let's say they deny it because they don't meet a standard. If the applicant disagrees with that, they can appeal staff determination, and they start going up in the process. So it eventually gets to the board. Also, if for certain parts of the code, there is a administrative waiver system that has a process on how these waivers can be approved. So like, for example, for the urban corridors, we created a system that says up to 10% of a dimensional requirement, staff can approve it. So they were given that flexibility up to a certain point. It's not just waiving a regulation, it's allowing let's say, a reduction on a setback or an increase in height that does not account for more than 10%. If it is more than 10, it goes through a public process.
So to waive a requirement, it has to go to the board, essentially.
If it is more than that cap that I'm mentioning, the
Right.
10%, and then for some other regulations that we have in place today, where it says that if it is an overriding public interest, like let's say they cannot provide the additional buffers. The comprehensive plan says you may request a waiver if there is an overriding public interest. So that would go to the board, only the board.
Okay, let me ask you a specific question. It's something I've experienced in another municipality. I'm an engineer, a consulting engineer. So I had a project that had a requirement for a sidewalk and a right-of-way adjacent to a development, a project. So there was a technical requirement that required sidewalk in the right-of-way that created an unsafe condition. It's something that probably maybe the county engineer should have an opinion on, where they would have the ability to determine if it was a condition that was unsafe to the public. Mm-hmm. But it sounds like you're saying something like that would have to then go to the board to make a decision on.
Something like that would be addressed in the land development code. And at this point, we're looking at just the plan. Those details in the code, we're still working on those. Mm-hmm. There is a section in the code that addresses that, public improvements. And that's something that we are going to look at. But at this point, we have not made any decisions, or we don't have any specific recommendations for that.
The reason that this is in my thoughts right now is that I'm in a position where I have to ask the board in another municipality to waive the requirement to keep the public safe, not build a sidewalk right adjacent to the pavement. So
Yeah, and those are the types of issues that don't really belong in the comprehensive plan. They should be addressed in the land development code. The comprehensive plan should be land use in general and not the specific requirement. So that will be, when we talk about the land development code, we'll get into that.
okay, all right. Mr. Horgan.
I have a question. Back on the exhibits, DD talks about exotic plants not being removed.
Yes.
What are the cases where exotic plants will not be removed?
The code is very specific on the situations where they should not, or where the county should allow them to not remove them. And I don't know if you can get to that section right now, but I think it had to do with, like, if they provide buffering at this time and they want to preserve that buffer, I think staff could, or the department director could approve them to keep it instead of removing it. The other one had to do with, do you remember? There were two other situations.
It came up at the board meeting. I actually attended that.
Yes.
And there was two cases. One was where it provided a stabilization of the bank on a perennial stream or something like that. It was to provide stabilization of a bank.
Stabilization was the other
Couldn't
one.
be removed.
Yes.
But there was also a discussion at that time that there was no reason that if it's provide buffering, visual buffering, well, take it out and replace it with something else that isn't exotic. Just because somebody says it's providing a visual buffer doesn't mean you leave exotic plants all over the state.
We've had to have cases in the past that have had Australian pines that provide a thick buffer, and then if you have to remove all of that and plant a little 3-inch caliber tree that takes a long time to grow, the adjacent neighborhood asks that it be phased. So it just means that sometimes staff can administratively allow a phasing plan to allow the removal of the nuisance exotics. And that can be done administratively. It's not done all at once. Does that make sense?
But it would be required to be removed over time.
Yes.
There's no permanent leaving exotic plants in a location other than on a riparian.
No, not that I know of. It's just to allow the gradual removal of the exotics. And Mr. Knable can respond to that.
In wetlands, we don't require them to remove them in wetlands at this time right now, just in the buffers because of the fact of impacting the wetlands themselves. But we're currently looking into that right now. But
So let's say there is a preserve area in a subdivision, and it's got a lot of Brazilian peppers in there. They're allowed to remain?
if there's like say a wetland buffer, we require them to remove the Brazilian pepper. Some of the reasons in the wetlands is because of the fact of the spraying and things like that. So there's issues with removing. We have had consultants that go in and actually remove them in the wetland areas because the problem is if you don't remove them from the wetland areas,
They invade the rest of it.
yeah, they will more than likely come back into your buffers. And then with the other, like what Lisa was saying, that we do sometimes phase removal of the in the buffers just for the visual impacts and things like that.
Just to kind of get us back on track, if you can see on the exhibit DD, and where we're going with this, with the looking at the special approval, there is a check mark in every requirement to rezone, special permit, preliminary site plan, preliminary plat, final site plan. So that just means the special approval process, whether you go through any of those type of applications, we have to look at removal of exotics. So it's not necessarily board driven. It can be administratively done. So we're just trying to clean that up and clarify it.
The 50 different activities required by a special approval, this is being proposed. This isn't something isn't existing in the code?
That's existing. That's existing between the comprehensive plan today and the land development code, where the term special approval is in both documents.
Has this been modified is my question. Is it,
That's
what are we looking at here? Is this existing code, proposed revisions, or?
This is existing. This
Carry
is just showing
forward.
you the terms where special approval is used and
Okay.
how many times it's within the code and comprehensive plan.
Okay, thank you.
And that table, which is in Chapter 3 of the Land Development Code, will eventually go away. The table, as a table, will go away. The requirements will not, which that was a point of confusion last time. We're not deleting any of those regulations. What we're deleting is the need to go through special approval and replacing that with something else.
Thank you.
And so for each of the topics that we addressed during this in this project, we created a memo that you will eventually get before the hearing. And the memo has a little bit of background. It's, the typical staff report. Why are we looking at this? What the problems are, and what we're recommending. So you will get a table that has all those 50-plus items and explaining next to it whether we're changing it from special approval to special permit or to board review or to administrative review, or we're just deleting the requirement for special approval. So next slide. We're going to go now to plan development and explain a little bit what the issues are with plan development. Next slide. So basically, a plan development happens when the comprehensive plan or the land development code says you have to go through plan development. It's, like I mentioned before, it's typically for a specialized purpose and for types of projects that are not the typical norm in a zoning district. You typically use plan development when you want flexibility of regulations, where your setbacks and your height and those things are just not working. And the comp plan and the code also say that if you're mixing any uses, plan development. If you're going to do higher densities and intensities than allowed in your zoning code, you go plan development. If you're going to preserve natural features, which you shouldn't make it more difficult for people to preserve natural features, but it would send you through plan development. Sometimes you have to include certain stipulations. Then it says you would have to go through plan development to be able to do that. And like I mentioned before, the comp plan even talks about if you have to do additional buffers and screenings, you would have to go through that process. All that is kind of contrary to what the comprehensive plan says about plan developments, because it says that that the county should provide for a plan unit development review process that minimizes the duration of reviews and the number of discretionary approvals. When you do a plan development, it's a very involved process and it can get very expensive. Because basically, the applicant will have to provide a number of plans with some level of specificity, come to a public hearing, and they don't know what they're going to get out, if they're going to get the approval that they want, or modified, or maybe a denial. So after all that expense, sometimes they don't know what they're going to get. From the public side, let's say you're next door to a UF3, future land use category, and let's say that they have a mixed-use zoning, and all of a sudden they get a notice in the mail saying that the owners are requesting plan development approval. What does that mean? Oh, they want to do something that is not typically allowed in that district. So now we have to go to meetings to find out what they want to do. Now we have to get up and speak if we're in opposition or in favor of the request, and they don't know what's going to be approved next door to them. So sometimes that level of predictability is just not there with plan development. So plan development is not completely bad. They serve a purpose, so they need to be used, but they should not be used as the tool to address every problem that you may have. Next slide. Now, typically when you go to other communities, you find that they typically have 1, 2, maybe 3 types of plan development. In Manatee County, we have more than 10 specific plan development districts. So they have become zoning districts, basically, where, if you do a PDC, you have standards that you have to go and, try to meet, and, with certain level of flexibility, but there are certain requirements in the code for that type of district. So that was kind of peculiar. And we're not changing those, we're going to keep those. But with that in mind, we're going to go to the next one. Next slide. So we looked at how much plan development do we have in Manatee County? And we realized that if you look at the area west of the future development area boundary, almost 50% of the land has already gotten plan development. And yes, a lot of those are probably voluntary, but some of those were just something that the county forced them to do. Next slide. So looking at the comprehensive plan, trying to figure out, okay, when is the comprehensive plan requiring plan development, and is it a good idea or not? So when you are in the UF3 and the mixed use future land use categories. Now, UF3, you have to think that it includes a lot of the land that is between the urban core and the rural area. So there are no zoning districts implementing those land use categories. So that's why we had to say planned development, because there was no other way of doing anything in those districts. In other portions of the comprehensive plan, it says that in order to mitigate negative impacts on adjacent uses, you would go through planned development. Well, if we have zoning, setback, and buffer requirements that apply to different types of uses, why would you want to take that through a board hearing? Densities and intensities above a certain level, but still not up to the maximum, what I mentioned before, residential 6, but anything above 4.5 requires PD. Why don't we establish districts that would allow you to get there? And when you do a rezoning, you still have to go through the process. You still have to go through the planning commission. You still have to go to the board to get that rezoning approved. Now, granted, they're not going to come with a detailed site plan, but you look at the table of uses, you look at the dimensional standards, and you know what type of development could happen in that district. If you're going to do mixed residential and industrial, that sends you through planned development. Well, if you have standards for those uses, and if somebody wants to mix the two uses and both uses are allowed, why couldn't we allow it through the zoning? Affordable housing. This is one that was very peculiar because, as you recall, I said that it requires special approval. It also requires planned development. When you're going to do an affordable housing project, you know that the funds are scarce. I mean, you don't have a lot of money to go through the review process. So now, on top of the special approval, now we're telling them that they have to prepare site plans to go through an approval process. And we do have standards in the code that say if you're going to get a density bonus for affordable housing, these are the provisions that you have to meet. Proximity to transit, and it talks about having to have an agreement where they're going to keep the units at a certain price range. So there are certain requirements already there that address all the some of the issues that you would have to deal with the special approval or plan development. And then number 6 was one that we thought, that one is a little bit too much. If you do a 3,500 square foot commercial use associated with an agricultural stand, you have to go through PD. So a PD for a 3,500 square foot building, it's a little too much. Sometimes when we have uses that we think may not be compatible with the surrounding area, those are the special permit uses. So why couldn't we address that one that way? And a parenthesis here, when a hearing officer is reviewing a special permit use, Lisa mentioned it is open to the public, but the decisions are made based on evidence. If somebody comes in and they have evidence that that new use is going to negatively impact their property values, their use of their property, the hearing officer will review those things. But it's not the type of approval where somebody comes and says, I don't like that use. It's like proof to me that it is going to be a detriment.
Is the hearing officer staff or a third party?
Madam, Mr. Chair, if I may qualify for a minute, the hearing officer not only open to the public, it's a duly noticed and advertised public hearing, notice mailed to everyone. The hearing officer is an attorney. There's a rotation list of several hearing officers, and they do event. What's different from the board, they come out with instead of an ordinance, come out with an order with findings of fact, conclusions of law. But the hearing is conducted like a quasi-judicial hearing, much like you do here.
And then if the applicant or public seeks appeal, is it?
It's appealable at circuit court.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, can I go to the next slide? Okay, so the bottom line for PDs, we do have requirements for buffers. So we addressed one aspect of PDs. We are, as part of this process, we're establishing some new zoning districts, so we'll address some of the other concerns. And for certain uses, we're just going to require a special permit instead. Now, PD will still be required for certain activities, like if you're in the PSP or AT or FIG land use categories, you still have to go PD, because those are very specialized types of uses. And then we also have something about the entranceway corridors where we have specific standards, but if you do not want to meet those standards, then you go through PD. And voluntary. Anybody who wants to do a PD, they can still do that. And there will be a memo issued with all this background. So next slide. Clustering, very quickly going through this. Next slide. The comprehensive plan says that if you're going to cluster for the preservation of open space or environmentally sensitive lands, you have to go through special approval and PD and all these complicated things. And also, if you're going to preserve a portion of your site for agriculture and then cluster your development on the other side, you still have to go through all these processes. So next slide. What we're proposing to do, and this is just a graphic representation. If you look at the development on the left and the development on the right, they have exactly the same number of lots. The difference is that on the left, in order to protect that wooded area, we allow them to do smaller lots. And they were able to achieve the same density in the same land. Next slide. So what we're proposing to do is we created a new section in the code, and it says if you're going to do clustering, these are your standards. You have to make sure it's allowed in your district. You have to make sure that the density is not going to be exceeded. You have to have a minimum development site size. There's going to be a minimum lot size, and it depends on which district you're in. We're going to have setback requirements. Unit site requirements is something that we're still considering, but we may not have that. And compatibility. Like we may say, for example, that all those lots that you're creating that are adjacent to another subdivision that has larger lots, those lots need to match those dimensions. So we want to make sure that we protect the people adjacent to the development. And there will be a memo on that subject too. The next.
Question? So does that only apply if somebody's coming in and dropping a small lot subdivision out in the middle of nowhere? I mean, that's what it sounded like you were saying, that if it's next to a subdivision that has 100-foot wide lots,
yes,
you're not going to allow them to go to 40-foot wide lots.
The land development code will say how small they can go. So it's not like if you're in a residential one where you have the expansive lots that all of a sudden they're going to go to the tiny lots next door. No, it's gradual. So if you're in, residential one, it's this much. If you're in residential 9, then it's that much. So if you're in agriculture, for example, you can still do it, but it's not going to be as small a lot as it would be in another district. So it's proportional to whatever the code allows today. I think it is a 50% reduction up to a certain minimum.
We have a hard break at 9 o'clock, and I see we're on 23 of 40
Some of them go
sheets.
fast.
So, if we could, let's try to power through this and get on to the public hearing.
Okay, for the next topic, it was just looking at your comprehensive plan, looking at your zoning regulations, and making sure that they connect, that they talk to each other. Next slide. We have a number of future land use categories, next, and we have a number of zoning districts, and they didn't really communicate to each other. Next. So what we're proposing is to include a table in the land development code, and we don't need to look at the details now in terms of which district go here or there, because we're going to do that when we get to the land development code. But at this level for the comprehensive plan, it's just letting you know that we're going to be doing that. So that table tells you which zoning districts we're creating new, which are the ones in orange, and which districts would be permissible if somebody's doing commercial locational criteria, which is establishing activity nodes, commercial nodes within residential areas, and also which districts would be permissible if you're going to do affordable housing using a density bonus. So again, the details, we can work those out when we get to the land development code, but at this level, just wanted to let you know that that's where we're heading. Next. We're cleaning up the language that establishes the land use categories, because the way it is written right now, it's very detailed. It talks about specific uses, so we're cleaning all that up. Next. And then there is a table in your comprehensive plan, the future land use element, that talks about densities and intensities. So this is where we're showing the changes that we're proposing. So the changes that we're proposing in terms of density, we're proposing to change, for the residential portion, we're not changing any densities. For intensity for non-residential, we're proposing to change the FAR from 0.23 to 0.35 in certain land use categories. Then we're also proposing to specify in this table what is the maximum density you can do with affordable housing and the maximum density and intensity that you could do in an activity node. I'll talk about activity nodes later. Next. And for the non-residential districts, we're proposing to increase the density for retail office residential and mixed use. And same thing for the FARs, making some adjustments. Next. In terms of mixed use is something that we want to encourage. And we noticed that there were a lot of obstacles to doing mixed use in the county. Next. If you are in the mixed use future land use category, right now you have to go through plan development. There is no other way. Next. If you're in the UF3 land use category, and look how much of that we have, you have to go through plan development. That's why we have so much plan development. Next. This slide shows how much of it has already become PD. The green areas show what's still ag. Next. And the green shows vacant lands. Next. Commercial locational criteria. This is something that has been in the plan for many years. Basically, it says that if you are at a certain type of intersection, whether it's arterial, collector, or a combination of the two, you could come to the county and say, can I establish a node, a neighborhood commercial node, a community serving commercial node? So the only way you can do that today is through PD. So what we're proposing is to continue the same system with some modifications, but allow the applicants to rezone to a standard zoning district instead of PD. Next. So the current system talks about whether you do so many square feet here, so many square feet there, what would throw you through special approval requirements. We're working on that table to streamline it a little bit more. Next. Next. So we created this chart that specifies how those nodes are created and how you can select a zoning district to implement these nodes. The idea is that you have that expansive area of UF3. If we allow all that to develop as residential, those people are going to have to drive miles to go to get a bag of bread or milk. So we want to make sure that we create nodes where people will have services to go to within walking distance or short driving distance. Next. So the bottom line here is that we are proposing to eliminate special approval and plan development for some activities and replace it with a different process for other activities. We're creating that correlation table between future land use and zoning. We are increasing some densities and intensities in activity nodes and in conjunction with affordable housing, and in certain instances with the regular future land use category. And then we are proposing to allow the activity nodes based on commercial locational criteria, but without rezoning to PD. Next. In terms of the schedule, next, we are planning to come back to you with the plan amendments on May 10th. Then we would go to the board and request transmittal. That would be on June 7. That would be transmitting to the state for review. Then the adoption at the board level would be September 6th. And then after that, then we come back to you with the land development code amendments. And those are going to be more detailed, more specific. And that would happen later this year. And that's it for my presentation. So if you have any questions.
Have a
1 minute.
Just a
Sorry.
seconds, but no, I appreciate that, and I would like to say something that this was focused on the comprehensive plan. I did something that I often caution about in going into the land development code with questions that are associated with the comprehensive plan. So we need to focus that on the fact that we're talking about the comprehensive plan. This is the first process in the entitlement of activities on certain land. So appreciate the presentation. Is there any other questions, comments, or concerns with regard to anything we've heard today?
Okay. Connerly, if I could,
Sure.
I just would like the public and the commission to know that the draft staff report and the amendments for the comprehensive plan are on our website. So you don't have to wait until the agenda is published for the May hearing. The draft is out there. So at a minimum, if everybody just reads the staff report, I think you'll get a better understanding of what the amendments are about.
Very good, thank you. And that's the staff report that will be presented at the public hearings, correct?
It's in May.
Thank you. Anything else? If not, I'll go ahead and close the public hearing. I'm sorry, the workshop. We're going to take a 5-minute break. It's 9 o'clock right now. We'll come back at 9:05 to begin the public hearing.